My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and lots of people have talked about the fact that Tolkien's greatest theme in the Lord of the Rings, at least, is arguably the idea of friendship. I mean, come on, Volume 1 is the Fellowship of the Ring, and there's a lot about that. And there's a whole bunch of discussion around the very close relationship between Frodo and Sam, and also other members of the Fellowship. And you can find a lot of the same kind of thing outside of The Lord of the Rings, like Fingon and Maedhros, Beleg and Turin. You can find all these things all over the place. But something struck me recently when I was thinking about a completely different topic for a video that I think really highlights this in a way that I hadn't thought of before, and maybe nobody else has really touched on. And that is the fact that if you really look at it, Turin's main fault is probably something like the lack of, if not friendship precisely, then at least close relationships in general that he actually focuses on. And what brought this to my mind actually was, ironically, I was thinking about doing a video, which I am still going to do in the future, probably multiple, on ranking different Lord of the Rings memes. And the one that caught my eye that led to this was one where Gandalf is holding Samwise up really high and like handing him to Frodo and saying, "It's dangerous to go alone, take this," which of course is like a callback to the original Legend of Zelda game, if you know what that is. So the thing that it made me think of was, in the Legend of Zelda, what happens is this old man in a cave says it's dangerous to go alone, take this, and he's giving you a sword. So he's giving you a weapon. And looking at this meme, I was like, okay, so friendship is the weapon, essentially. And if you think about it, that is kind of true in a lot of ways in a lot of Tolkien stuff. Friendship is very often the greatest weapon that any of the heroes have to work with. Because mostly without the friendship that they have with each other, they don't succeed. Turin is, well, of all of Tolkien's heroes, if we want to call him that, he's kind of an anti-hero, I guess. Turin is the one that really lacks any kind of close friendship with anybody. And that's, not 100% true, but I'll explain, why the exceptions kind of fit the rule anyway. So let's take a look at Turin and contrast him with a lot of the other characters that we get. So, obviously, like I've already said, in most of Tolkien's stories, the idea of friendship is a really big deal, and friendship is something that really makes a big difference in a lot of the stories. I've talked about the fact recently that a lot of Tolkien's greatest heroes actually don't accomplish a lot on their own and don't necessarily get credit for the things that they did on their own. The things that they're most known for, they had assistance with, like Beren gets a lot of help from Luthien, Frodo gets a lot of help from Sam, this kind of thing. So a lot of the heroes accomplish what they accomplish precisely because they are either accompanied by a very close friend, or in the case of Beren and Luthien, more than just friends. So you have a lot of cases like that. You also have other things like the fact that, Merry and Pippin are both relatives and friends, and together they accomplish a lot of the things that they do in the Lord of the Rings together, but, they also kind of split ways at some point and don't have a whole lot to do with each other at some point. Legolas and Gimli become great friends, and, we don't necessarily see anything great accomplished as a result of that, but there's still, this idea that their friendship is extremely important, and they both end up doing things together that they would never have done alone. Like, Gimli decides that he'll visit Fangorn if Legolas comes to the Glittering Caves with him. We don't know much of the detail about Aragorn and Gandalf's relationship, but we know that they befriend each other fairly early in Aragorn's life, and this probably shapes a lot of who Aragorn is, and contributes a lot to his success in his own very long-term quest to become king of Gondor and Arnor, and thus marry Arwen. So you've got all of that. You've got Fingon and Maedhros. Fingon very famously saves Maedhros when their families are feuding to the point of civil war almost. And you've got a lot of other very close friendship type stories as well in the rest of the Silmarillion, like Tuor and Varanwe. They become friends and they manage to get all the way to Gondolin despite the fact that Gondolin is now closed. There's, just story after story after story about the power of friendship in Tolkien. Turin doesn't really have a lot of friends. He has really only about one friend in the entire story, and that's Beleg, and I'll get to him in a little more detail. And he only has really one close relationship outside of that he spends any time on, and that's his own sister, who he doesn't realize is his own sister, and yeah. But anyway, Turin is the one character who accomplishes a lot of stuff just on his own and never really develops close relationships with anybody around him. And this actually kind of puts me in mind of the one of those Yoda quotes from the Star Wars movies where Luke Skywalker first finds out who he is and he's trying to talk Yoda into training him, and Yoda is talking to Obi-Wan's ghost and says,
"This one long time have I watched. Always he has looked away to the future, to the horizon, never his mind on where he was, what he was doing."
And if you think about it, that's kind of Turin's whole mentality. Turin is constantly thinking about not where he is and the people around him at the moment. He is thinking about his mom and his sister he's never met and how he can do something to get back to that relationship. The trauma of being separated from both of his parents has basically scarred him to the point that he doesn't really have a whole lot of close relationships at all. And, for Tolkien, of course, missing parents is also another theme that recurs a lot. And I'm not saying that, losing both your parents is kind of like an automatic, you're just going to end up wrong, because obviously Beren loses both of his parents and his father in a really, ugly kind of way. So it's not like all people who lose both of their parents end up in really bad, a really bad mental and emotional health state. So that's not what I'm saying. But Tolkien, of course, would have been familiar with the kind of trauma that losing your parents causes. Tolkien lost his father when he was only about 3 or 4, and he lost his mother at about the age of 12. Turin, interestingly enough, was not too far from the age of 12 when he had to leave his mother and go live in Doriath. And ever since that point, he was actually a little younger, I think 9 if I'm remembering right. But he has to leave and go to Doriath, and he lives as basically the foster son of King Thingol, and he's constantly thinking about his mother. His focus is on the messages that they get from the mother, and then when basically those messages stop, he gets more and more depressed. Now, I'm going to be referencing the kind of longer version of the Turin story, so if you haven't read any of the stuff outside of the Silmarillion, some of this material may be a little new to you, but you can get it in the Children of Hurin standalone volume, or you can get it in the Unfinished Tales version of the story. But let's look at Turin's life kind of from start to finish. He has, as one of his very early friends, a servant in his father's household who is lame from wounding himself with an axe, who gives him a knife, and he, treats him really kindly. Or actually, sorry, not, let me rephrase that because it was unclear. Turin gives the other person a knife that he gets as a gift, and his mother chides him for this, basically saying, you were given this really nice gift and you just give it away to somebody who's kind of not very good with sharp weapons. And his father's like, don't beat him up about it. He's actually being really kind and showing generosity. Turin in this early phase of life was a very different kind of person than he grows up to be. And one of the things that's really interesting about Turin's story is all the parallels. By the end of his life, he will not be showing generosity to a lame person. He will be killing one out of malice. So that tells you a lot about what happens to Turin in between those two things. But he's doing this, he's showing friendship and, love and care to somebody who is beneath him in both rank and in terms of like just his ability to get around. And I don't mean beneath him in like a bad sense, but like in a medieval kind of context, that's kind of the way that that would have been seen. So he has that as a friendship, and he unfortunately kind of has to leave that behind at some point. Uh, and then when he's in Doriath, in this longer version, he also makes another friend, sort of. Uh, it's it's a complicated relationship in the sense that we don't know a whole lot of details about it because Tolkien didn't write too much on it. But there's an elf in Doriath named Nellas, and Nellos befriends him and teaches him a lot of things. But as he becomes more and more depressed after the messages from his mom stops, and as he eventually starts actually going out to be on the marches with Beleg and some of the other elves, that relationship kind of ceases. And later, Beleg will talk to Turin about her and tell him, hey, Nellis gave testimony that basically saved your bacon and proved that you weren't the instigator of the problem with Cyros, who was the one that tried to ambush him and kill him, and then Turin chases him and accidentally gets him killed. And Turin's like, who are you talking about? And Beleg's response is, man, what is wrong with you that you don't remember this person? Because they were close friends for a few years. So you start to see a pattern here, right? I mean, you don't necessarily see the pattern immediately because we don't know how Turin is going to turn around and treat another lame person until the very end of the story. So we don't see how the relationship with, the servant in his father's household is going to kind of reverse itself later on. And it doesn't reverse itself as to that character specifically. But then, his next major relationship, he of course has a foster relationship with Thingol and Melian, but we never get the sense that they're close emotionally or anything like that. Beleg becomes kind of his next major connection to anybody, outside of his own family. And that is a very martial relationship. I mean, they're out there fighting together. So, I mean, very much kind of band of brothers type relationship, not necessarily a familial or very close just emotional friend relationship. It's not the kind of person necessarily that you go to for everything, but they become friends because they just are doing a lot of fighting and probably saving each other a lot on the front lines. Nevertheless, they become very close friends, and when Turin eventually leaves, kind of self-exiles himself, Beleg, basically asks Thingol, I want to go after him and tell him that he's been basically exonerated of the alleged murder of Cyros. Beleg, for his part, cares a lot about Turin, and Thingol does too, and so does Melian. But Beleg is, the one who really goes out on a limb and tries to bring Turin back. He eventually catches up with Turin. Turin is hanging out with a bunch of outlaws, and he basically says, I'm not going back. Beleg tries to convince him, and he won't do it. Beleg says, well, okay, you're always welcome, and you can find us in Doriath. And Turin says, well, you can find me on Amon Ruth, not even knowing really what he's saying. And then they go their separate ways. Beleg will eventually come back again to try to find Turin. Turin, in the meantime, kind of befriends Mime the Petty Dwarf. But again, the nature of their relationship is not clear. We do know that the outlaws that he's been hanging out with are kind of like, why is he spending so much time with this dwarf? It's kind of suspicious, and we don't really like it. And we know that he talks lots with Mime the Dwarf, but we don't know really a whole lot beyond that. And then, of course, Mime will actually end up, betraying the whole group. So how good of a relationship was that really? Kind of hard to say. But Beleg also comes back before that betrayal happens, and Beleg chooses to stay with Turin. So we can see here that what the friends that Turin has, they tend to go a lot farther in trying to maintain the relationship with him than he does vice versa. Turin lets his pride get in the way of going back to Doriath with Beleg. Beleg, despite leaving him, hoping that he changes his mind, eventually says, well, I'm not going to just leave him out there. I'm going to go back and try to help him. And they do a lot of things together. They kind of create sort of a mini fiefdom where they're defending the borders against Morgoth's, raiding companies and whatever. But of course, eventually they get betrayed, and then Turin gets hauled off. Beleg is left for dead. Beleg, after he heals himself enough to be able to go anywhere, follows along and tries to catch up with Turin. And, eventually does catch up and rescues him after also running into another elf who's escaped Angband, who will become Turin's next friend. And that, of course, is Gwyndor. And they both manage to get into the orc camp and rescue Turin and bring him out. Unfortunately, of course, this is where Beleg, trying to free Turin from his bonds, accidentally pricks Turin with the sword Anglachel, and Turin wakes up and then kills Beleg, thinking him an orc. So, obviously, this is not an intentional rupturing of the friendship by Turin, but it's another really good example of Turin breaking the relationship that the other party didn't want to break. And then when he realizes what he's done, he kind of loses his mind. And then Gwyndor is the one that has to basically get him all the way to Nargothrond by himself. As a result, Turin does, have a good relationship with Gwyndor. He, basically has kind of a life debt to him. But again, you don't necessarily get the sense that that relationship goes super deep. He has an appreciation for him, and he's thankful for what he did and whatnot, but you never get any indication that they had just a really, really close relationship. The closest thing that he ever really got to this point was Beleg, at least since leaving his mother. Gwyndor, for his part, had previously been planning to marry Finduilas, the daughter of Orodreth, who is now king of Nargothrond because Felagund is dead because of the Silmaril quest. Rather inconvenient. But Gwyndor is now kind of misshapen and kind of a shell of who he formerly was because of his time in slavery under Morgoth. And now Finduilas falls in love with Turin, who for his part doesn't really notice her, basically. It's not ever really clear exactly why that is, but the interesting thing about that relationship, which is not mutual at all, is that Gwyndor, on his deathbed, when Nargothrond is about to be sacked because Glaurung brings a huge army to crush it, he basically tells Turin, if you save Finduilas, you'll probably be alright, but if you don't, you're probably doomed. He doesn't use exactly those words. And it's always been, and I've talked about this before, how this seems kind of a strange thing. Why would that be, right? Is he saying that, if he rescues her, that they'll actually end up together and that'll satisfy what he needs? Maybe, but it doesn't seem likely. Or is it just that he needs to focus on somebody that is actually there at hand, where he is and what he's doing, to paraphrase Yoda. So, does this have something to do with that same exact theme? I suspect it does, but it's not really clear how that works. The foretellings of elves on their deathbeds aren't, laid out with 100% precision and all details. Nevertheless, of course, he does not manage to rescue Finduilas. He comes too late because he is deceived by Glaurung and ends up going after his mom and sister again. And as a result, Finduilas is dead before he can come to her. And then he goes and lives with the men of Brethil. And he has, a couple people there that he's kind of friends with again because they sort of take him in. And he is, again, friends out of gratitude in a sense. But he's never on very good terms with Brondir, who's the leader and also the lame person that he's going to end up murdering by the end of the story. And so he's still basically in the same position of having some people that are kind of close acquaintances, but not really close friends. And then the sister that he never met before and who has forgotten who she is shows up. And for the first time in his life, he finally finds contentment, probably because it's his sister, and we all know where that goes. So yeah, And unfortunately, they go a little further than that. He doesn't realize, of course, what's going on. But there's, I think, something to the fact that she is his sister, even though he doesn't realize it. And that is why he finally gets a sense of, like, I'm okay with who I am now. Because up until that point, that never really happens. He's always itching to do something. And even though he still wants to go out and fight, kind of on the front lines, Nienor, or Niniel, as she is called at the time, convinces him basically, if you want to marry me, you got to stay home. And even though he doesn't want to, he does. It's like the first time he's ever given in to anybody. So at some level, it seems like Turin recognizes who she is. That this is the person that he's been trying to get to his whole life, even though he doesn't actually know that that's who that is. And for whatever reason, this settles him down for a while. And then, of course, Glaurung shows up, and, all that goes to pot, and he has to kill Glaurung to save Brethil, and Niniel finds out who she is, and Turin finds out, and then he kills Brondir because he doesn't want to believe it, and Brondir is basically telling him, hey, you married your sister, bro. And he kills Brondir, which, kind of completes that cycle going back all the way to the beginning. And then Moblung shows up, and Moblung was, as far as we know, never close friends with Turin, but certainly they knew each other. And unfortunately, he has to give him the bad news that they're looking for Niniel, and he basically confirms by accident, not knowing that Nienor is dead, that, yeah, that was Nienor that you married, dude. And as a result, Moblung kind of causes the suicide of Turin, because once Turin has this confirmed, he despairs and kills himself. And Moblung, realizing this, says in the story, alas, because, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but something along the lines of, alas, because I brought news that caused the death of somebody I loved. So Moblung, for his part, says that he loved Turin. Again, so probably like Beleg, but not as close, was on friendly terms with Turin, but didn't, ever have that kind of a relationship that Beleg did. And that's the other interesting thing about this. We find out in Nargothrond, a lot of the elves seem to really look up to and like Turin. This seems to be the case almost everywhere he goes. He's just a magnet for a lot of attention and, well-meaning attention. But he never reciprocates. And he never has any relationship that he ties to that tie him down. He's always, looking for that other thing on the horizon. And as a result, he keeps going off the rails. So when you look at it, Turin is basically the one guy who never had a real solid friendship that he could just kind of stay with and focus on and develop in a way that satisfied him to not need more. He was always looking for something else. And it was that looking for something else that always got him to the point of, either revealing himself to Morgoth or getting himself into trouble or whatever it was. So this lack of friendship, or in the case of his, family, lack of, close family ties, really seems to be part of his downfall. It's almost like the curse of Morgoth really boils down to just being separated from his mom and his sister and not being okay with that. Because if you look at it through that lens, you could kind of see it all works out just, with that one thing. And this contrasts so heavily with almost every other major character in Tolkien's works, because almost everybody else is really close with at least one other person who goes with them through thick and thin, to the ends of the earth, to death itself, and back again, depending on which story you're looking at. Turin never has that. Well, he has half of that, because there's probably several people that would have been that for him, but he never reciprocates. And that is really, I think, Turin's major weakness. his PTSD or whatever it is from separating from his mom at a young age and having already lost his father, at least as far as anybody knew he was dead, really sets him up for not being able to form close relationships with basically anybody. And unfortunately, that just ends up kind of ruining his life in a lot of ways, which makes you wonder if Morwen and Nienor had actually been able to get out of Hithlum and make it to Doriath before Turin left. Would that have just been it? Would he have just lived in Doriath for the rest of his days and not had any problems and everything would have been hunky-dory? We'll never know, of course, but I really think this is probably like the key to a lot of Turin's issues. So I thought it was just really interesting to look at that because of the major contrast. I've talked about Turin and his problems before, but, you know, like I said, just seeing that meme and thinking about friendship as a weapon and then, thinking of Turin's life in terms of that, it really kind of works. So I think that's really fascinating. Hope you all think it's fascinating. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below if you have different theories or if you think I'm maybe going a little overboard on this. But also give the video a thumbs up if you thought it was at least worth watching. Share it around. Make sure you subscribe on whatever platform you're watching on. If it's YouTube, make sure to click the bell icon to make sure that you don't miss any future notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions every week, and check out the link in the description below for other support and social links. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namaste. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour and Robert Kindling.